Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here. Now I'm back with my GW36 cheat sheet preview. This is an interesting week because I feel like a lot of us have been preparing as managers to head towards GW36 with maybe 2 free transfers and have been planning moves all week long really to go for City players and even Liverpool players. I think right now we are at a crossroads where the City players are a little bit less tempting, especially after the impacts of the Real Madrid game. And with Liverpool, it's a little bit more interesting because they didn't play the full 120 minutes. They do have an early game versus Spurs, and that is going to be a tough game where I actually expect both teams to score, which does have an impact on some of the kind of valuation of the Liverpool defenders this week. But some people are also calling to question, for example, the mental impacts on Man City. I will only just raise a point that in the 18-19 season, I think they had a similarly tough loss versus Tottenham where they lost on away goals and were still able to actually have a fantastic end towards the year with a great league campaign. And when I look at the game week and I look at the sort of fixtures that City have, I have to say it does benefit City from a defensive point of view. So if this week you are looking at going for City players, I think maybe a second defender still is quite sensible. The issue is the defenders are very restricted. You are probably someone who owns either Cancelo or Laporte right now, and if you wanted to add another one, I think the only one I'd really be comfortable with is Diaz. If you were feeling a little bit frisky, you could go for Zinchenko, but yes, he's sort of benefited by the Walker injury, but we also know that Nathan Ake could play left back, and that has a big impact on whether Zinchenko can actually play. I think Cancelo is more than likely nailed, just because he is so integral to the team. As far as the other sort of doubling options, you also have a bit of a dampener with Leicester, for example, where they have rotation. In teams like Arsenal, it only really seems to make sense to go for Saka and Nketiah. So the options are quite restricted. You could also do a little bit of future planning this week as well by moving into some of the Everton players, hoping that they do well away from home, and then bank in their fixtures when they actually are playing at home in Game Week 37. That's a possibility there too. If we start with the defenders, I would say that the biggest impact this week is Ben White's injury. We don't really have much news on that. It does seem like he might miss one of the games. And for that, I would probably recommend moving towards Tavares if you can. If you're someone who owns a defender who is around that sort of 4.3 to 4.7 price range, I think the options are really Tavares and Emerson. And the issue with Emerson, in my opinion, is just that he doesn't seem like a good doubler in this week, where even though I expect Spurs to actually score in both games, I don't actually think he's going to be integral in terms of the offensive point of view to actually evaluate being in your team. As far as Tavares, I do think there's a slight chance that they can actually get a clean sheet versus Leeds. I think Leeds haven't been performing particularly well away from home. The home support is amazing, and at home they have looked quite good. Even for City, even though it's a 4-0 game, I would say Leeds actually did look quite threatening at some points and were able to launch some quite successful counterattacks. Yes, this Arsenal team hasn't kept a clean sheet for a long time, but if there was ever a week where I think they could get a clean sheet, it would be the first fixture here versus Leeds. And then versus Spurs, no real faith in them there. Ben White and Tavares, therefore, at the same positions. With the Martin and Shard, they both fall. It's mostly due to fixtures. I would say with the Marty, he might not be worth a fall. If you are holding a Marty for your team and you're someone who's looking at bench boosting, then he could still be a good option to keep in your team. He's not really worth a transfer. It's really hard to move up from him right now because honestly, the next best defender, in my opinion, if you're looking for an upgrade, is going to be Cash or Matip, and that's quite a ways away budget-wise. So you could stick with the Marte if you are someone who already has him, but he probably wouldn't be someone I would prefer playing unless you had a bench boost. As far as Emerson, I've already kind of described how I feel about him. Just don't really see him getting the kind of points necessary for him to be worthwhile. Ake is just going to be a complete avoid this week. Yes, there's a lot of injury impacts to City players. Maybe if you're really feeling like he could play both games, that's possible because Laporte did look very tired in the Real Madrid match, and we know that he suffered probably what should have been a concussion in the previous game in the Premier League. So he probably is quite tired, but I still think Ake will only play one game, and therefore he's not really worth it. With Matip and Cash, you have Cash who is rising towards the top there. Matip is an interesting option because Konate was playing in the European game versus Villarreal, and I think that will actually lead towards Matip actually playing both games in the Premier League, which is good. By contrast, I would say Robertson did actually play versus Villarreal, so perhaps there could be scope for Tsimikas to play versus Villa, and that could actually hamper, let's say, Robertson's strength. But I wouldn't really think about taking Robertson out of your team unless you were thinking about trying to beef up, let's say, your forward line or your midfield line by moving into a side grade transfer like Matip, because there is quite a bit of a cost cut there moving from Robertson to Matip. Cash is a good option, not necessarily for this week. I still think they have one good fixture versus Burnley, but you are kind of evaluating Cash for the next double game week where they have what should be on paper a very, very good one, and I like Cash in that spot there. Gabriel is someone who still is in a little bit of a weird position where I think Arsenal are less likely to actually keep clean sheets, but he is always a goal threat. But he did recently score, and I know that's not how football works. You could score headers on back-to-back weeks, but the chances of that are quite low, and I think that's sort of what kind of distracts me from pushing Gabriel up this week, even though he has on paper a good double, I think, to actually score. Dean and Zinchenko, these are both differentials. Dean is a weird one because he's pretty much at the same price as Cash, and I wouldn't really concern myself going for Dean over Cash. He does seem a little bit more injury prone than Cash as well, and simply when it actually has come to the sort of results and the underlying stats, I don't think Dean actually outmatches Cash at all. And therefore there's no real reason to actually kind of tempt yourself with Dean, who is a little bit more of a differential. Zinchenko will be a differential. Walker did re-injure himself in the Real Madrid game, so I don't really see him joining the City team maybe at least within 2 to 3 weeks time. I think he really completely ran himself into the ground, and Pep will understand that even though Walker should play an important part for the City defense, that his health, I think long term, is probably more important, and Zinchenko will play a lot of consistent minutes. Zinchenko doesn't necessarily involve himself in attack as much as Cancelo, and that is a little bit of a worry. And so when I compare him to options like Laporte and Diaz, I'm not actually so fond of going for him the way we traditionally move towards fullbacks, such as, for example, an option like Cash as opposed to Mings, or even, let's say, Robertson and Trent over Van Dijk. I do think because Diaz and Laporte are such good goal threats, and Zinchenko isn't necessarily such a kind of attacking threat, that you probably are better off with going for Diaz and Laporte just because they are going to be more nailed. As far as Alonso, he is someone who's in his own tier right now just because he's at such a good price point. He's a great transfer down from James, but this isn't really the week to do that. I think Chelsea have on paper what should be two very good doubles, and if you do have the combination of Alonso and James, I would be quite inclined towards playing them, because I think anytime you get to play Wolves right now seems to be a clean sheet. Their attacking numbers are extremely low, and it doesn't seem like they're at a position where they can really contend for Europe, so therefore they don't seem like they're super involved in games. We've also heard about a training ground sort of bust up with the manager, so not exactly the kind of best news on the Wolves front, and I don't imagine that they'll be stinging Chelsea too hard. Of course, Chelsea did sort of do the exact same by losing to Everton, but I will say that Everton did seem like they're actually playing quite progressive attacking football at the time. With Gordon and Richarlison and Gray, they both seem like very good attacking options, and you have work rates from Iwobi, fantastic performances as well from Pickford, which actually allowed Everton to keep the clean sheet. I'm not super sold on Chelsea being an avoid for now. I think Chelsea options are still great in my opinion. I have moved Rudiger actually down this weekend, so he is the one fall, because for me Laporte and Diaz is going to be priority. I think if you are a Laporte owner, you'd probably just want to keep him. If you have the chances side grading to Diaz, I probably would maybe try do that. I think there is a little bit of upside there to chase, and I do think Laporte might be able to be rotated with, let's say if Ake plays left centre back, which he definitely can, and we see Zinchenko playing left back, there is scope for Laporte to be benched, and John Stones might be able to come back, but I think Diaz is so essential. I think Pep always wants to have one of Laporte Diaz on the field, so I wouldn't really go for the side grade, but moving into Diaz is a very good option this week. Van Dijk and James, no real kind of movements there. The issue with James, of course, is I think Alonso has presented himself as a very good option for pretty much, once again, a cut rate price, and also someone who could also provide similar attacking returns. James, I would say, probably does get involved in more attacking chances without the game, but Alonso does always find himself in good positions to actually score, and we know he is always quite a clinical finisher, so that's the sort of benefit and the upside there. And with nowadays us moving into, let's say, one or two Chelsea players, I think you probably want to stick with one Chelsea defender, and if you had the option of picking in between the two of them, it would always be Alonso, just because of what he presents as a budget cut. Rudiger falls for the same reason. I just think he isn't really kind of matching his valuation. This Chelsea team hasn't really done extremely well from the defensive point of view, and when you compare to Liverpool and City and how important the games are, I just think that both of these teams will be laser focused in terms of both keeping clean sheets and also trying to make sure that they maximize every single game towards the end of the season, whereas I can't say the same for Chelsea. As far as Guaita and Foster, no real movements there. Foster is definitely a rise. He's going to be an interesting option for this week as a doubler, and someone who's very cheap. So if you are looking for a keeper who is a standalone kind of doubler in 36, then he is an interesting option. As far as Sanchez, he does fall. I think Brighton will probably suffer versus United. I thought United looked very, very good. And when it comes down to it, he just has less fixtures than some of the other keepers, so he has to fall. Schmeichel's still at the top there, but he is going to be matched with Ramsdale, in my opinion, as I said, because I do think Arsenal have a good opportunity of capturing a clean sheet versus Leeds, and they also have a good opportunity when we think about Game Week 38 of getting a clean sheet versus Everton. They have Tomiyasu back, so that's quite a big plus. Obviously, Tavares isn't the same as Tierney, but I wouldn't say that Tierney was, the one piece that was kind of holding this Arsenal cog together. Partey was a part of that too, and I think this Arsenal team are finding a little bit more form and also playing within the kind of back four structure with Tomiyasu back, so that will be interesting, and I think that will be a big benefit for this Arsenal team if you're looking for a clean sheet, and Ramsdale will probably provide that on 36 and 38 potentially. At least I think the chances are very high when you compare them to similarly kind of price keepers like Schmeichel. With Schmeichel, even though the fixtures are so good, you know that Leicester will rotate players because they would put probably their best foot forwards versus Roma, which will also impact their starting 11, whereas Arsenal are pretty much only competing in the Premier League right now to actually fight for a Champions League spot. Now, let's move on to the midfielders. Ramsey and Gordon are interesting options this week. I think Gordon actually does rise towards the top because he is much more interesting as an offensive asset for the next 2 weeks for me. And I think there will be scope as well for Dewsbury Hall to be rotated in the future. We did see that happen actually in the previous week where, unfortunately, I think when you're looking at 4.4 option and you're looking for him to come off the bench, and Ramsey and Gordon are such attacking options who have consistently scored, always kind of found themselves within the box, and in Gordon's kind of case in point being someone who takes set pieces and free kicks at times, I just really can't compare those two options to Dewsbury Hall. I think Ramsey and Gordon are both better options, especially when you think about 37, which is going to be the priority week for either Ramsey or Gordon. I think you'd probably be better off with choosing one of them as opposed to Dewsbury Hall. Odegaard is someone who falls. I think a lot of the expected metrics do suggest that Odegaard is a great option. And yes, he is someone who's nailed in this Arsenal team. But I have to say he simply is just playing in the midfield, and that does hamper his ability to actually contribute to the games. He can score from deep sometimes, but I think the expectation of that is very low. He is going to be someone who's always nailed, I would say, to get maybe an assist every 2 games or so, because he is such a visionary kind of player, and he is essential to this Arsenal team. But I'm not so interested in Odegaard really as an FPL asset. And I think Martinelli, for example, even Smith Rowe could have chances of actually matching him, even if they just play 1 week or 1 game week out of the 2 or 1 fixture, sorry. And with Gallagher and Gray, those are both avoids right now. I'd say with Gallagher, I just think Zaha is just much comparably a better option. He is playing in the sort of offensive positions, and Gallagher is playing much deeper in the midfield. Whereas Gray, the issue with him is that Gordon exists and presents himself at such a great price, and then also Richarlison is the main focal point of the team. So you're kind of picking between 2 of the kind of best options, either someone who's a budget cutter or someone who is going to be the talisman of the team, and therefore I think Gray just is a little bit of an avoid. Although he is one to think about if you are in a little bit of a weird team structure state and you're looking for the sort of 5.x midfielder who could provide something for you within 36 and 37. Saka is still the sort of reigning king here. Maddison, I've preemptively put the kind of 3 asterisks on him because he didn't play in the previous league game, and we know that it was a re-aggravation of his hip injury that Brendan Rodgers mentioned in his press conference. I don't really know whether he'll play versus Roma at the time of recording, and for me, the concern with Maddison is even if he does play versus Roma, there is a high chance that he will be rotated just so that he can be rested and managed, and so he doesn't re-injure himself by playing too frequently in this double game week. With Kulusevski, he rises even though the fixtures on paper are poor. I would say they're poor from a metric where you're thinking about Spurs and the results. Let's say it's going to be very tough for Spurs to get the full 6 points from Liverpool and Arsenal. But when I do think about how these games will go, the North London derby and also the Spurs-Liverpool game, especially reminding myself with the early Conte-Liverpool game, I just think it's a game where both teams will score, and Kulusevski is someone who is absolutely integral to the offense. One thing I will say is that Kulusevski did actually start from the bench in the previous game, but the reason why I'm still rising him is because for me, there was a drastic change from when Lucas Moura was subbed off and Kulusevski came on. Kulusevski was either dribbling all the way towards goal or just finding people in space and being much more controlled, as I said, in the box time and time again, compared to someone like Lucas Moura, who, when you pass the ball to him, you kind of do pray that he's able to do something. And unfortunately, he's just not able to pull that sort of magic out versus more organized defenses in the Premier League. And I don't really see him doing that versus a Liverpool or versus an Arsenal. I'd be much more confident in Kulusevski doing that because he is such a good manipulator of the ball and someone who who actually has very, very good vision, I think, for his young age. As far as Barnes, he falls. He's been benched 4 out of 5 games recently, and as a Barnes owner myself, I just have no real interest in owning him. He might play the next 2 games because players who are involved in the Roma game need rest, but I really just don't see it. I think he's sort of played himself out with form. He did score a goal versus Everton, but I would say it was a little bit of like it was sort of a tapping opportunity. The underlying numbers have started to drop and move towards the favor of Madison, and both of them are rotatable options that I'm not really interested in. Much prefer if I was, let's say, going to own an asset from a rotating team, that it would be coming from a Chelsea or a City who probably will put in more goals and have players be more kind of affected by that. Rafinha is someone who's still a differential. I just think that he is occupying a weird spot where he is between Kulusevski and he is between Saka, and more than likely you're going to have both Saka and Kulusevski, so therefore Rafinha doesn't seem like he actually holds much weight in this sort of price tier, and I think that's the issue with Rafinha right now. With Mount and Zaha, it's an interesting one here. Zaha is definitely a great option because he came off the bench, got his rest, and scored. And I think he will be a great option 37, undoubtedly. With Mount, he has played a lot of consistent 90 minutes, and he hasn't been rested at all. Now, on one hand, it does suggest that Tuchel relies on Mount and thinks that he is one of the sort of difference makers. And I think when you look at the games and the chances that he's had in multiple games, even when it comes to creating, let's say, an assist versus Man United for Reece James in the dying stage of the game, or just the amount of shots that he's been able to crack from range that are both very effective, and also him in sort of being involved with the volley before the great double Pickford save is also kind of a key sign that I think Mount is to stay in this Tuchel system, but I think he might get rest in one of these 2 games. I just think that because he's such a good option in Game Week 38, where he plays Watford at home, the Mount is still going to be a top option for now, and I would be a little bit hesitant moving away from Mount unless it was to someone like Luis Diaz that you can see just right below. Coutinho is someone who I've dropped as a fall. I don't think he necessarily is outside of, let's say, Gerrard's sort of preferred playing 11. He didn't have the most illustrious game last week when they beat Norwich 2-0, and I think Buendia came on and actually provided an assist immediately, so that is a little bit of an interesting sign. I do think that sort of new kind of club bounce has sort of dropped off for Coutinho. I don't think the underlying numbers have really married up to some of the sensational hauls that we've seen earlier on in the season, and I do think he is actually hitting a bad run of form, and when you compare him to someone like Zaha, for example, I just think I'd be much more interested in Zaha in 37 because he is actually still showing that sort of form. Whereas with Coutinho, you are hoping that he can pull out the magic that he does possess. With Diaz, I have to say he's been a very consistent performer with Liverpool, and I have preferred him over Jota for a while now, but it's been tough to actually kind of evaluate Diaz as a top green option because there is the element of rotation in this Liverpool team. Whereas when you look at someone like Foden, he plays so consistently for Man City that he should be considered as a green option. But I have to say, having played 120 minutes with Real Madrid, being one of the few kind of key attacking players that wasn't subbed off for Pep, does suggest to me that Foden is going to be still at that sort of weird tier where we do expect rotation in the Newcastle game. The same with Jota because he did start versus Villarreal, and I think there is a good opportunity, especially if the Tottenham Liverpool game is as open as I think it will be, that Diaz will probably provide a lot of attacking returns there and hopefully maybe start another game back to back versus Villa, but it could be a little bit of wishful thinking. I just think that if you are chasing upside this week, the one player in this sort of price bracket is going to be Luis Diaz that interests you. As far as Mahrez and Sterling, really no interest there. Mahrez could be a little bit of punt. He was subbed off early, so that City could actually try and consolidate on that lead versus Real Madrid, but it didn't end up working out. And perhaps there will be opportunities for Mahrez to actually play in the Premier League now, because usually he is the type of player who gets rested in the Premier League games and then actually plays in the European games because he has the confidence in Pep, I think, to play in those sorts of fixtures. With Sterling, I just think that, once again, he's so expensive. He's always going to be the comparison to Son, and I mean, why bother? With KDB, I would actually say that he's a rise this week, even though he was rotated in the Man City game for what was a little bit of a lackluster performance compared to his usual standards. I do think that the fact that City no longer are in other competitions means that you no longer have this sort of rotation threat hurting KDB as an option. KDB will probably just play all the league games towards the end of the season, and I think it's the same sort of situation with Bernardo, where we've seen rest for both these players. City's best 11 involves both of them, and therefore both of them will play towards the end of the season. With Bruno, he's a fall. I mean, there's just no real interest in United. They have a lot of fixtures. I mean, very, very few fixtures left compared to the rest, and there's no real reason to go into Amani, for example, who's just a little bit too expensive, sorry, when you consider in the rotation and also the threat of Jota and Diaz as rotation options, especially since Salah was just rested versus Newcastle. If we move into the forwards, it's a very, very short list, and it's very hard to select from them. I've actually dropped Pukki to the tier of Nketiah and Dennis. I think all of them have interesting weeks. I thought Dennis had a good game once again last week where he was playing versus Burnley, and if you look at the underlying stats, he was the sort of one player who was creating key chances and key opportunities for this Watford team. But I really don't think that overall as a side that they're able to really create much. I think you are kind of hoping for a little bit of Dennis magic here. Whereas by contrast with Nketiah, you have someone who is not necessarily the focal point of the team, but someone who has looked extremely good from expected goal involvements. And this Arsenal team does build a lot of consistent opportunities. So when it comes down to it, as the striker of the team and someone who seemingly has deposed Lacazette from that sort of starting position in the team, I do think Nketiah is extremely interesting. Pukki does fall though for me because I do think there's always going to be a little bit of a drop sometimes when a team gets relegated. Yes, they'll have these sort of one-off results with, let's say, West Brom versus Chelsea last year, or even Sheffield United when they picked up some points towards the end of the season. But I do think that some heads will drop, and Pukki just isn't necessarily the greatest option. I think when their sort of relegation life was on the line last week, I just didn't really see much at all from this Norwich team, and unfortunately Pukki was uninvolved once again. So he has to sort of fall because I don't really think that there are many good options once again in this price tier. For me, Tony falls, but heading towards Game Week 38, he could definitely be a good option to think about because he has such a good fixture versus Leeds at home, and that will be quite a benefit towards Tony when you're looking at options like Richarlison or Watkins or Ings later down the list, because he could be the downgrade that you go for in that kind of final fixture of the season. If you're not interested, let's say, in Everton versus Arsenal, Richarlison is the one who rises, and Watkins and Ings are also people who have kind of involved themselves in the clean sheet. It's simply a case of Aston Villa having the fixtures. With Richarlison, I have to say that he is the primary option. Yes, there's a little bit of a question mark in terms of, I think, the FA potentially handing a suspension to him, but I don't really think that's going to happen. I think that would be too kind of calamitous a decision to make, and it would be such a big impact on Everton's season since they are sort of fighting come out of relegation that it would be quite a ridiculous decision to make. I think Richarlison is the best option because from open play, I still think he is the most interesting option, and the fact that he is the penalty taker for this team as well is a huge plus. Whereas with Watkins and Ings, I do think that they've also shown some glimpses of brilliance this season, but they're nowhere near the talismanic option that I think that Richarlison is to this Everton team. He's so involved in open play and also from set pieces that I think it's incomparable really to go for an option like Watkins and Ings. I think if you're looking at bench boosting, perhaps Watkins is a good option for this week, but I wouldn't really be tempted. You probably only want to have one striker at this price bracket, and in my opinion, it would be Richarlison. If you want to push yourself a little bit even further, then I think Jesus could be one option to look at. He was someone who got a little bit of rest in terms of not being involved in extra time versus Real Madrid. However, he has played a lot of consistent games from when you consider all the other forwards, and he is someone who could actually play all the positions on the field quite easily. Pep has transformed him into someone who can capably play as a winger. But recently we've seen a lot of goal scoring returns from Jesus, as we expect when he is playing in the centre forward position, and he has done quite well there. And I think the sort of level of the opponent will drop when you're considering that they are playing versus weaker opponents and not Real Madrid. So Jesus definitely is an interesting option this week. He's definitely someone who joins this clean sheet, and it was really nice to see him last week sort of back up his Watford performance with a goal again, with once again a Foden assist in the previous week. With Werner, he just falls. I think it's clear this Chelsea team just isn't building enough chances, I would say, as they usually do. Someone posted a sort of metric on how much sort of kilometers were covered by Chelsea players, and I think there was almost like a 5% difference between Everton and Chelsea, or even 5 to 10%, and that kind of shows that they're at different stages of the season. Everton clearly have everything to play for, whereas Chelsea don't necessarily, unless we see them dropping a bunch of points. But we know Arsenal and Spurs, I still imagine will drop points because they will be also competing with themselves, or even playing versus Liverpool. I do think this Chelsea team will perhaps get at least one win in this week, but can I really call on Werner to be one of my options who at a 8.5 price or 8.4 price will be doing everything for me? Potentially not, and I think therefore Werner has to leave the team. Kane is a rise for me, even though Son is the one who's actually getting most of the points haul-wise from FPL in recent weeks. I think the fact that Kane has actually been so consistent lately once again raises the question of whether maybe you should just go Kane and Son instead, you know, especially for Game Week 38 when you're looking at the Norwich fixture. So therefore, Kane, for me, is just one of those top options. Ronaldo remains the differential. I mean, he's been incredible lately, and he's backed up his performances. He could very much well haul in single game weeks, but I much prefer backing up players who have very consistent records. Kane is someone who, for example, has a very consistent record versus Arsenal, North London derbies. As far as Liverpool, not necessarily the same, but we did see once again an iteration of that match earlier in the season, and it was still quite open and a great opportunity for Kane and Son and even Kulusevski to kind of prey on Liverpool's high line at times. So that's it for the cheat sheet this week. I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead, and I'll see you guys very shortly for my team selection video.